Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring MTG's newest Planeswalker, at least lore-wise, Quintorius Loremaster. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds, or instead use our newly acquired affiliate link with Game Nerds in the description below if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product for Commander Masters or any of the other sets that they offer for some of the lowest prices around, all while helping out the channel as you do so. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commanders we'll be covering in the next few weeks. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Quintorius Loremaster is a 3/5 elephant cleric with vigilance that costs 3 a red and a white that has the following abilities. Firstly, at the beginning of our end step, we exile target non-creature, non-land card from our graveyard to create a 3/2 red-white spirit creature token. And secondly, we can pay 1 a red, a white, tap Quintorius, and sack a spirit to choose a card exiled with Quintorius, which we can then cast without paying its mana cost, and, if that spell would be sent to our graveyard, we send it to the bottom of our deck instead. Breaking down his core stats, Quint is sporting a decently high CMC, a below-average stat block for his cost with built-in vigilance to at least make use of his average toughness on defense, and a pair of abilities that allow us to, over time, reuse resources from our graveyard by exiling them and casting them again later while passively building up our board presence with decent-sized tokens. Taking a closer look at his first ability, at face value, it allows us to turn any non-creature non-land in our graveyard into a 3/2 spirit once per turn. Technically, having Quint come in with 6/7 worth of stats across 2 bodies on the turn he comes down, assuming we have a card to exile, which typically shouldn't be an issue considering the wide array of loot effects that Boros has at its disposal, and then gets us an additional free body on each of our subsequent turns provided we keep the non-creature spells going to the bin. Though do keep in mind that this is not a May trigger, so it can conflict with any other means to recur resources from our bin that we happen to be running. This then leads nicely into Quint's second ability, which allows us to pay 3 and sack a spirit that either he created previously or any other spirit in order to cast a spell he previously exiled at no mana cost, which not only gets us extra uses out of our non-creature spells, but can also do so at a discount if the spell in question is CMC 4 or more, resulting in our commander being a pseudo-reanimator of sorts that can help us reuse and or cheat out our high CMC non-creature spells from our bin, which is quite a unique ability for a Boros commander. That said, this ability is not without its flaws. Firstly, since it is a tap ability, it does require Quint to typically spend a full turn on the field before we're able to use it unless we're able to grant him haste, and, even then, the spell in question is still limited to timing restrictions, meaning, unless we can cast it at flash speed, we'll still need to wait for the turn to get back to us anyway to be able to cast it. And secondly, if Quintorius is removed before we can cast the spells he exiled, we'll lose the ability to cast those spells at all, since the resummoned Quintorius is technically a new creature and not the one who exiled the spells initially, resulting in any spells that he exiled previously to remain in exile with him having no other ways to access them, which is worth keeping in mind if you have a spell you really want to cast but are concerned about your opponent's removal. So, as we can see, Quintorius is quite an interesting Boros commander that cares about non-creature spells in our graveyard, aiming to quote-unquote reanimate them to be used again or to cheat them into play at a reduced mana cost, which is not only a unique concept in our color combination, but also allows him to helm a variety of deck archetypes effectively. And while yes, Spirit Tribal and big spells are certainly solid directions to take him in, I personally decided to take this build in a Super Friends direction focused around reanimating walkers from our graveyard. You see, since Planeswalkers are permanents, we don't have to worry about them shuffling themselves back into the deck after we cast them from exile. They'll naturally send themselves to our graveyard by using their minus abilities, or as our opponents attack them to enable our commander to bring them back, and a good number of them are able to create tokens for us so we can still build up our board presence despite our low creature count. Not to mention that our commander's decently sturdy body and a passive token creation will give them additional protection if our opponents want to attack into them, enabling our walkers to stick around for longer and get to their back-breaking ultimates to completely take over the game. And in order to supplement this game plan even further, we'll be running a decent number of Planeswalker support pieces that our commander can get us extra uses out of, such as Planeswalker tutors to ensure we can get the Planeswalkers we want directly to our hand, Planeswalker-focused sagas that both help the Super Friends game plan and are superb alongside Quintorius, who can keep bringing them back into play over and over again to generate even more value, and of course ways to proliferate or get extra uses out of our Planeswalkers to make them more impactful, ensuring that our walkers will have no issues completely overwhelming our opponents with the plethora of powerful effects that they bring to the table. So let us make our way to Arcavios, where Killian, Rutha, Dina, Zamon, and our commander Quintorius are making one final stand against the invading Phyrexian forces with the Invocation of the Founders, the only magic ritual powerful enough to stop the Phyrexian invasion of the plane. But as the ritual neared its completion, one last desperate Phyrexian attack disrupted it, threatening to extinguish their only hope, and it was at this moment that Quintorius knew what needed to be done. With one last look at his friends, he channeled his life force directly into the spell in one last desperate attempt to stabilize it, fully aware that this action would cost him his life. But in the end, it was not death that awaited him. Instead, the unstable ritual completed, shattering the Biblioplex and annihilating all the Phyrexians in a wave of destruction, and Quintorius burned, consumed in a conflagration of light that emanated from within himself, and in a brilliant flash he was gone, flung into the blind eternities as his spark ignited, his past chapter as a Lorehold student now complete, and his future as a Planeswalker just beginning. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Skipping straight to the CMC2 slot, we have its first of two members, Grateful Apparition, a 1/1 flyer that, whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, proliferates, serving as a cheap evasive body that allows us to easily multiply our walkers' loyalty counters as it swings in to get extra uses out of them. Then as our second and only other entrant in this slot, we have Onaki Oathkeeper, a 0/4 that prevents creatures from attacking planeswalkers we control unless their controllers pay 1, in addition to letting us pay 4 double white and exiling it from our graveyard to return target planeswalker from our graveyard to the battlefield. Initially serving as a cheap defensive body that helps screen attacks against our walkers while we set up our board, and later, when it's inevitably destroyed, giving us another way to reanimate our walkers alongside our commander if we have the mana to get even more uses out of them. Then moving on to the CMC3 slot, we open with a trio of Planeswalker-focused legendaries in the form of Lae'zel Valakith's Champion, Mila Crafty Companion, and the Peregrine Dynamo. Lae'zel is a 3/3 that, whenever we would put one or more counters on ourselves or a creature or planeswalker we control, we put that many counters +1 on that player or permanent instead, effectively allowing our walkers to come into play with an additional loyalty counter, and making all of their plus abilities and our proliferation sources increase their loyalty even faster, which is superb for getting to their ultimates as soon as possible. Mila is an MDFC whose front face is a 2/3 that, whenever an opponent attacks one or more planeswalkers we control, puts a loyalty counter on each planeswalker we control, and, whenever a permanent we control is targeted by a spell or ability an opponent controls, lets us draw a card, making her a great way to de-incentivize our opponents from attacking us or using removal on our walkers, unless they want to make them bigger or generate us card advantage as they do so. Then her back face, Luca Wayward Bonder, is a Planeswalker that costs 4 and double red, comes into play with 5 loyalty, and has the following abilities. His +1 has us discard a card to draw a card, or 2 cards instead if we discard a creature. His -2 lets us return target creature from our graveyard to the battlefield, exiling it on our next upkeep. And his -7 gives us an emblem that, whenever a creature ETBs under our control, has it deal damage equal to its power to any target, who will generally not be using over Mila, but can be useful in the late game if we can quickly get to his emblem, which synergizes very well with our token creation game plan to help push for lethal. The Peregrine Dynamo is a 1/5 with haste that we can pay 1 in tap to copy the activated or triggered ability of another legendary source we control that's not our commander, serving as a cheap way for us to copy any of our walkers' loyalty abilities, even their ultimates, to get additional uses out of them and continue pressing our advantage. Burnished Heart then wraps up our CMC 3 slot, which is a 2/2 that we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, making it a solid form of land-based ramp, which is a rarity in our colors, to help pay for Quint's activated ability while still having mana left over to hardcast other spells. Then reaching the CMC 4 slot, we have its only entrant, Mungara the Diplomat, who is a 2/4 that, whenever an opponent attacks us or planeswalkers we control with 2+ creatures, or casts their second spell each turn, draws us a card, making him another superb way to de-incentivize our opponents from attacking us or our walkers, as well as a way for us to benefit from them casting multiple spells per turn by generating us repeatable card advantage if and when they do so. The first half of the CMC 5 slot then brings us some more direct Planeswalker support in the form of Jaya's Phoenix, a 3/3 hasty flyer that, whenever it deals combat damage to a player or Planeswalker, lets us copy the next loyalty ability we activate that turn, and, if it's in our graveyard, lets us return it to the battlefield whenever we cast a Planeswalker spell, allowing us to easily double up on our walker's most powerful abilities very reliably on the turn it comes down and on subsequent turns, while also being quite resilient thanks to the large amount of walkers we have in our build, ensuring we'll usually have access to it once we cast it or get it into our bin. Then to wrap up our CMC 5 slot, we have the legend Jeru with Eyes Open, a 4/3 with Vigilance that, when he ETBs, lets us search our deck for a Planeswalker and puts it into our hand, and, whenever a source would deal damage to a Planeswalker we control, prevents 1 of that damage, making him an archetypal tutor when he comes down to improve consistency, that then helps take the edge off any damage our Planeswalkers would take for good measure to help them stick around for longer. And finally, skipping to the CMC 7 slot, we have our last creature entry, Amiria Shepherd, a 4/4 flyer that, whenever a land ETBs under our control, either lets us return a permanent from our graveyard back to hand, or, if that land is a plains, returns it to the battlefield instead, making it an expensive but repeatable way to supplement our Walker Reanimation game plan with a manaless way to bring our walkers back, as well as other permanents so long as we keep making our land drops. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. Our instant category this time around is going to be pretty slim, consisting entirely of single entry slots, the first of which is the CMC 2 entry, Thrill of Possibility, which has us discard a card to draw 2, serving as a cheap way for us to pitch our high CMC walkers to enable our commander, while simultaneously allowing us to dig for lands, support pieces, or cheaper walkers, which is invaluable in the early game to improve consistency. The CMC 3 slot is then up next with its lone entry, Volt Charge, which deals 3 damage to any target and then proliferates, which works nicely alongside our commander as a targeted removal spell that we can use twice at instant speed, that also ups all our walkers' loyalty to enable them even further. And then jumping to the CMC 5 slot and to our last instant, we have Ignite the Beacon, which has us search our deck for 2 Planeswalkers and puts them into our hand, making it a somewhat expensive but flash speed tutor that we can use to search up our primary playmakers, and that Quint lets us cast again at a discount for even more tutoring. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Opening in the CMC1 slot, we have its singular entry, Faithless Looting, which has a draw 2, then discard 2, and has flashback for 2 and a red, providing the build with even more card selection and graveyard setup to improve consistency even further, that we can still use twice per game even without our commander. The CMC2 slot's 2 members, Cathartic Reunion and Thrilling Discovery, then provide us with even more draw and discard, both of which let us discard 2 to draw 3, the former also gaining us 2 life as we do so. Again, giving us more cheap means to pitch bricks to hopefully draw into playables and or land drops, while setting up our commander's token creation and reanimation. Then switching gears from rummage effects to tutors, the CMC3 slot brings us Call the Gatewatch and Search for Glory, the former letting us search our deck for a Planeswalker and puts it into our hand, while the latter searches up a snow permanent, legendary, or saga instead, both of which help us bring our most powerful Planeswalkers directly to hand at a reasonable rate, which again we can get double the use out of via our commander, and the latter alternatively allowing us to search up the handful of Planeswalker enabling legendary creatures and sagas that we'll be running instead if we need to. Then skipping all the way down to the CMC6 slot, we have our penultimate sorcery, Deploy the Gatewatch, which has us look at the top 7 cards of our deck and puts 2 Planeswalkers from among them into play, sending the rest to the bottom of our deck in a random order, which thanks to our critical mass of walkers has a solid chance of hitting 2 whenever we use it to build up our board, and again benefits from our commander being able to cast it again on the following turn to further load up our board with our primary playmakers. And then coming to the end of our sorceries, we jump to the CMC9 slot to reach our final entrant, Triumphant Reckoning, which returns all artifacts, enchantments, and planeswalkers from our graveyard to the battlefield, making it a powerful if expensive way for us to re-establish our boards in the late game if our opponents have been destroying our walkers, or to further press our advantage by mass reanimating more walkers that we previously sent to the bin through other means. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Jumping straight into the CMC3 slot for this category, we have its lone entrant, Oath of Gideon, which creates 2 1/1s for us when it ETBs and has each planeswalker we control ETB with an additional loyalty counter on it, making it a superb early drop that gives us some bodies to screen attacks with, and gives all our walkers moving forwards additional starting loyalty to get us even more use out of them. The CMC4 slot is then up next, opening up with a pair of Planeswalker auras in the form of Elspeth's Talent and Rowan's Talent. Elspeth's Talent grants the enchanted Planeswalker a new +1 loyalty ability, which creates 3 1/1 tokens, and, whenever we activate any of the enchanted Planeswalker's loyalty abilities, gives all creatures we control +2/+2 and vigilance until end of turn. The new loyalty ability it provides allowing us to easily build up our board state, while the mass AoE pump it grants empowers our token-heavy playstyle while still leaving blockers up for the inevitable crackback. Rowan's Talent also grants the enchanted Planeswalker a new +1 loyalty ability, this time granting target creature +2/+0 first strike and trample until end of turn, and whenever we activate a loyalty ability of the enchanted Planeswalker, we copy that ability. The new loyalty ability being okay to get in for extra damage, but the main draw this time around being allowing us to double up on any loyalty ability our walker uses for double the value, which can get out of control when copying ultimates, especially emblem-based ones. Then to close out this slot, we have Court of Grace, which makes us the Monarch when it ETBs, and, on our upkeep, either creates a 1/1 Flying Spirit token or a 4/4 Flying Angel token instead if we're the Monarch, which at base generates us extra card advantage via the crown and extra evasive bodies to screen attacks for us and our walkers, which since they're spirits, Quintorius can use to reanimate our spells, but also forces our opponents to decide whether they want to attack us to prevent us from drawing cards and creating evasive 4/4s, or attacking our walkers to prevent them from reaching their ultimates faster. And finally, reaching the CMC5 slot and our last 2 enchantments, we have the sagas Elspeth Conquers Death and Urza Assembles the Titans. Elspeth Conquers Death's first chapter exiles target permanent an opponent controls of CMC3+. Its second chapter makes all non-creature spells our opponents cast cost 2 more until our next turn. and whose third chapter returns target creature or planeswalker from our graveyard back into play with an additional +1/+1 or loyalty counter on it, which would be good on its own as a source of permanent removal and planeswalker reanimation, but is even more effective in this build since our commander can bring it back after it sacks itself to be used over and over again. Urza Assembles the Titans has read ahead. Its first chapter has a Scry 4, then reveal the top card of our deck, letting us draw it if it's a planeswalker. Its second chapter lets us put a planeswalker of CMC 6 or less from our hand into play, and its last chapter lets us activate the abilities of our walkers twice that turn instead of once. All its chapters being good for us by letting us dig for our primary playmakers, cheating them into play for us, and getting extra activations out of them. And, like the previous entry, Quint can bring right back into play for us when it uses itself up to get us even more uses out of it. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Beginning in the CMC 1 slot, we have the pair of Ramp Sources Sol Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble starting us off, the former tapping for 2 colorless and the latter letting us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, both of which help us speed up and or fix our mana base, which we'll certainly need to get to our high CMC commander and planeswalkers, as well as having enough mana to activate our commander every turn while still having mana to cast other spells. We'll then continue on the ramp game plan as we enter the CMC 2 slot with our Mana Rock collection, which consists of Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Felwar Stone, which taps for any color an opponent's land would be able to produce, Boros Signet, which lets us pay 1 and tap it for both our colors, Talisman of Conviction, which taps for a colorless or either of our colors instead if we take a damage, and Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and lets us pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card, all serving as even more cheap sources of ramp and or fixing to speed up our mana base even further. Then to wrap up our CMC 2 slot, we have the 2 non-ramp focused artifacts, Contagion Clasp and Idol of Oblivion. Contagion Clasp, when it ETBs, puts a -1/-1 counter on target creature, in addition to letting us pay 4 and tap it to proliferate, which we'll be primarily using as a means to increase our walkers' loyalty counters when we have the mana to spare, but its -1/-1 counter distribution can still be useful to remove small utility creatures or to soften up bigger targets as we proliferate. Idol of Oblivion lets us tap it to draw a card if we created a token that turn, in addition to letting us pay 8, tap it and sack it to create a 10/10 token, which alongside our commander can passively draw us an extra card per turn at no mana cost that also gives us the option to turn it into a gigantic beatstick in the late game if we need to. Then reaching the CMC 3 slot, we have even more mana rocks joining us in the form of Gatewatch Beacon, Commander Sphere, and Honor-Worn Shaku. Gatewatch Beacon taps for a white, ETBs with 3 loyalty counters on it, and, whenever a planeswalker ETBs under our control, lets us move a loyalty counter from it onto that planeswalker, making it an on-theme mana rock that helps passively grow our walkers' loyalty as we summon them, that also benefits from all our proliferation sources so we can continue to get uses out of it. Commander Sphere taps for any color in our commander's color identity, and we can sack it to draw a card, serving as a passable mana rock that works nicely alongside our commander to initially generate mana, and that we can later sack away to draw a card and create a spirit token if we need to. Honor-Worn Shaku taps for a colorless and lets us tap a legendary permanent we control to untap it, effectively turning all our walkers into colorless mana rocks to provide an insane amount of ramp for us the instant it comes down, that only gets better as we use it to cast more walkers. And then to close out this slot, we have Rings of Bright Hearth, which lets us pay 2 whenever we activate a non-mana ability to copy that ability, allowing us to copy any of our walkers' loyalty abilities for 2 mana a pop to get even more mileage out of them, which again is absolutely crazy when copying ultimates. And then reaching the end of our artifacts, the CMC4 slot brings us the newly reprinted Planeswalker support piece, the Chain Veil, which deals 2 damage to us on our end step if we don't activate a loyalty ability of a Planeswalker that turn, and lets us pay 4 and tap it to allow each Planeswalker we control to activate one of its loyalty abilities as though none had been activated that turn, doubling our walker's effectiveness for the bargain price of 4 mana a pop, allowing them to accumulate loyalty much faster to get to their ults, or to downtick themselves faster so that our commander or other sources can bring them back with full loyalty to be used again. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Diving right into the CMC3 slot, we begin with a pair of white Planeswalkers, those being Teo Geometric Tactician and Gideon of the Trials. Teo Geometric Tactician comes into play with 3 loyalty and creates a 0/4 token with Defender and Flying when he ETBs. His +1 has us and target opponent draw a card, and his -2 has us choose right or left, limiting each player to only being able to attack the closest player in the chosen direction until our next turn, making him a very defensive walker thanks to the free body and attack floodgate he brings to the table, while also serving as a decent source of repeatable card advantage that may be partially symmetrical, but does give us the option to select the least threatening player at the table, or at least a player willing to negotiate. Gideon of the Trials comes into play with 3 loyalty. His +1 prevents all damage target permanent would deal until our next turn. His +0 makes him a 4/4 creature with indestructible and prevents all damage that would be dealt to him until the end of the turn. And his other +0 gives us an emblem that, so long as we control a Gideon Planeswalker, prevents us from losing the game and prevents our opponents from winning the game, making this Gideon another defensive walker that can blank damage from any permanent for a full turn to help keep us and our walkers alive, and instantly giving us access to an emblem that keeps the game going for as long as he or any of our other Gideons remain in play, in addition to also being able to turn into a creature to swing in with to keep the pressure up. Then as our lone red Planeswalker in this slot, we have Chandra, Acolyte of Flame, who comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her first +0 puts a loyalty counter on each red Planeswalker we control. Her second +0 creates 2 1/1s with haste that sack themselves on the next end step, and whose -2 lets us cast a CMC3 or less instant or sorcery from our graveyard, exiling it when we do so. Her first ability alone earning her a spot on this list as a means to repeatedly tick up both her own and our other 10 Planeswalkers' loyalty every turn, but her token creation also being useful as a means to keep the pressure up, and whose spell recursion can help us get extra uses out of spells that we'd rather not waste our commander's ability on. Then proceeding to the CMC4 slot, we'll open with another pair of Chandras, those being Chandra Fire Artisan and Chandra Torch of Defiance. Chandra Fire Artisan comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her passive makes it so that whenever 1 or more loyalty counters are removed from her, she deals that much damage to target opponent or Planeswalker. Her +1 exiles the top card of our deck and lets us play it that turn, and her -7 exiles the top 7 cards of our deck and lets us play them that turn instead, serving primarily as a source of repeatable card advantage in this build, which, if our opponents attack or allow us to get to her ult, can deal a hefty amount of burn to them as well. Chandra Torch of Defiance also comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her first +1 exiles the top card of our deck, letting us cast that card, and if we don't cast that card, she deals 2 damage to each opponent. Her second +1 generates 2 red mana for us. Her -3 deals 4 damage to target creature, and her -7 creates an emblem that, whenever we cast a spell, deals 5 damage to any target, making her an incredibly flexible walker that provides draw, ramp, and removal to our build, as well as a back-breaking ultimate that tacks on a significant amount of damage to every spell we cast, either from our hand or via our commander's effect to quickly close out games. Then as our singular Boros walker in this slot, we have Nahiri the Harbinger, who comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her +2 lets us discard a card to draw a card. Her -2 exiles target enchantment, tapped artifact, or tapped creature. And her -8 lets us search our deck for an artifact or creature, puts it into play with haste, and returns it to our hand on the next end step, granting us even more card selection and graveyard setup to enable Quint, decent non-destruction removal that can deal with a variety of threats, and an ultimate that we can use to tutor up a large number of Planeswalker support pieces directly from our deck into play for a turn to enable our Planeswalkers even further, which we can then hardcast on later turns as needed. And from there, it's on to our suite of mono-white Planeswalkers to close out this slot, starting with Archangel Elspeth, Gideon Ally of Zendikar, and the Wanderer. Archangel Elspeth comes into play with 4 loyalty, her +1 creates a 1/1 with lifelink, her -2 puts 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, makes it an angel, and grants it flying, and her -6 returns all non-land permanents of CMC 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, which will be mainly running for her first 2 abilities, which allow us to grow our board with tokens, then empower those and other tokens with counters while granting them permanent evasion, though her ultimate can be situationally useful to mass reanimate cheap walkers, creatures, and/or artifacts if we need to. Gideon Ally of Zendikar also comes into play with 4 loyalty. His +1 makes him into a 5/5 with indestructible and prevents all damage that would be dealt to him until the end of the turn. His +0 creates a 2/2 token, and his -4 gives us an emblem that grants all our creatures +1/+1. His repeatable token creation being nice, but his main draw being his -4, which he can use immediately as he comes down to permanently power up our entire board and send himself to the bin for Quint to bring him right back into play on the following turn to do so again, permanently and continually making our creatures more and more powerful with each passing turn. The Wanderer comes into play with 5 loyalty. Her passive prevents all combat damage that would be dealt to us or other permanents we control, and her -2 exiles target creature of power 4+. Her passive providing some decent protection against damage-dealing effects for both ourselves and our walkers, which can go a long way to keeping us and them alive against burn-heavy decks, and her -2's non-destruction spot removal being solid at removing big and/or otherwise resilient creatures. And then to wrap up this lot, we have Elspeth Knight-Errant and Ajani Steadfast. Elspeth Knight-Errant comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her first +1 creates a 1/1 token. Her second +1 grants target creature +3/+3 and flying until end of turn. And her -8 gives us an emblem that makes all artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and lands we control indestructible. Her first 2 abilities being very solid in their own right to help us build up our board presence and get in for evasive damage, and her ultimate often being the final nail in the coffin for our opponents by making the majority of our board almost impossible to deal with without mass non-destruction removal. Ajani Steadfast also comes into play with 4 loyalty. His +1 grants target creature +1/+1, first strike, vigilance, and trample until end of turn. His -2 puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control and a loyalty counter on each other planeswalker we control. And his -7 gives us an emblem that, if a source would deal damage to us or a planeswalker we control, prevents all but 1 of that damage, which will almost exclusively be running for his second ability, which permanently powers up our wide boards and loads up our walkers with counters to get them to their ultimates that much faster, though it should be noted that his ultimate can make us and our walkers virtually immune to damage if we're able to get to it. Moving on to the CMC 5 slot, we'll open up with another wave of white walkers in the form of Gideon Jura, Elspeth Tyrell, and Elspeth Resplendent. Gideon Jura comes into play with 6 loyalty. His +2 has target opponent's creatures attack him on their next turn if able. His -2 destroys target tapped creature, and his +0 makes him a 6/6 and prevents all damage that would be dealt to him until the end of the turn. His first ability serving as a passable way to pseudo-goad attacks away from ourselves and our other walkers to keep ourselves and/or them alive for longer. His creature removal being serviceable as creatures naturally attack into us or are forced to do so with his first ability, and, like all our other Gideons, serving as another body for us to swing in with to keep piling on the damage if the opportunity presents itself. Elspeth Tirel comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her +2 gains us 1 life for each creature we control. Her -2 creates 3 1/1 tokens, and her -5 destroys all other permanents except lands and tokens. Her first 2 abilities working quite nicely with our various sources of token creation to build up our board presence further and pad our life totals, and her ult, while devastating to our walkers, can be used to retake control of the board in a pinch, and at least leaves us with our tokens after the dust settles, while typically completely leveling our opponent's boards. Elspeth Resplendent comes into play with 5 loyalty. Her +1 puts a +1/+1 counter and either a flying, first strike, lifelink, or vigilance counter on up to 1 target creature. Her -3 has us look at the top 7 cards of our deck, letting us put a permanent of mana 3 or less from among them into play with a shield counter on it, while sending the rest to the bottom of our deck in a random order. And her -7 creates 5 3/3 flying tokens. Her first ability being decent at spreading counters and keywords to our token army, but her relatively easy to reach ultimate being the real draw here, allowing us to get 15/15 worth of evasive bodies onto the battlefield to swing in with and keep up the pressure. And then as our last 2 walkers in this slot, we have the red Planeswalkers, Sarkhan the Masterless and Chandra Legacy of Fire. Sarkhan the Masterless comes into play with 5 loyalty. His passive makes it so that whenever a creature attacks us or a planeswalker we control, each dragon we control deals 1 damage to that creature. His +1 turns each planeswalker we control into a 4/4 dragon with flying until end of turn, and his -3 creates a 4/4 flying dragon token. His +1 being incredibly powerful in this build, easily allowing us to assemble 20/20 plus worth of evasive stats out of nowhere by turning our walkers into creatures, while his passive and dragon token creation are an excellent form of protection to prevent small to mid-sized creatures from attacking into us without being destroyed instantly. Chandra Legacy of Fire comes into play with 3 loyalty. Her passive, at the beginning of our upkeep, deals X damage to each opponent, where X is equal to the number of planeswalkers we control. Her +1 generates us a red mana for each planeswalker we control, and her -0 lets us remove a loyalty counter from any number of permanents we control to exile that many cards off the top of our deck, letting us play them that turn. All of her abilities contributing perfectly to our Planeswalker heavy build by dealing burn, generating mana, and producing card advantage via impulse draw that scales as we get our walkers into play, making her a near perfect payoff for our Super Friends game plan. And at last, reaching the CMC 6 slot and our final wave of Planeswalkers, we start off with a trio of Chandras, those being Chandra Flamecaller, Chandra Flame's Fury, and Chandra Awakened Inferno. Chandra Flamecaller comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her +1 creates 2 3/1 tokens with haste that exile themselves on the next end step. Her +0 has us discard our hand and then draw that many cards +1, and her -X deals X damage to each creature. Her last ability easily allowing us to clear the board of all toughness 4 or less creatures, or 3 or less if we wish to keep her alive, while her token creation and her pseudo wheel that nets us a card work nicely to further supplement our token and graveyard focused game plans. Chandra Flame's Fury also comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her +1 deals 2 damage to any target. Her -2 deals 4 damage to target creature and 2 damage to its controller, and her -8 deals 10 damage to target player and each creature they control, making her a very reliable source of repeatable damage that we can use to hit face, deal with small to mid-sized creatures, and eventually use to wipe the board of our most dangerous opponent while dealing a quarter of their starting life total to boot. Chandra Awakened Inferno comes into play with 6 loyalty and can't be countered. Her +2 gives each opponent an emblem that deals 1 damage to them on their upkeep. Her -3 deals 3 damage to each non-elemental creature, and her -X deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, exiling them if they would die that turn. Her first ability putting a clock on the game by gifting our opponents an impossible to remove source of continual burn that will continually whittle away at their life totals and that we can continually give more of, while her other 2 abilities are excellent ways for us to keep the board clear of threats as we build up our Planeswalker army. Then as our final red Planeswalker, we have Rowan Kennereth, who comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her +2 has target player's creatures during their next turn, attack if able. Her -2 deals 3 damage to each tapped creature target player controls, and her -8 gives us an emblem that, whenever we activate a non-mana ability, copies it. Her first and second ability being a nice little combo we can use to force turtling opponents to drop their defenses, then mini-wipe them on the following turn, but her ultimate being the real reason we're running her, as it permanently allows us to copy all our walker's abilities from that point forward as we use them for even more value. Then joining us as the last pair of white Planeswalkers in our arsenal, we have the Eternal Wanderer and Elspeth, Sun's Champion. The Eternal Wanderer comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her passive prevents more than 1 creature from attacking her each combat. Her +1 exiles up to 1 target artifact or creature, returning it back to the battlefield under its owner's control on that player's next end step. Her +0 creates a 2/2 token with double strike, and her -4 has us, for each player, choose a creature that player controls, then has each player sacrifice all other creatures they control. Her ultimate serving as a potent non-destruction wipe that leaves us with our best creature while leaving our opponents with their worst, that we can use on the turn she comes down without even costing all of her loyalty to use, while her slow flicker is solid at temporarily removing our opponent's threats for a turn, and the double striking token she creates are a superb way for us to continually build up our board. Elspeth, Sun's Champion comes into play with 4 loyalty. Her +1 creates 3 1/1 tokens, her -3 destroys all creatures of power 4+, and her -7 gives us an emblem that grants all our creatures +2/+2 and flying. Her on-demand wipe as soon as she comes down, ensuring that our initially low power tokens remain in play as our opponent's bigger threats are wiped away, while her repeatable token creation and stat-bumping/evasion granting emblem-based ultimate fit perfectly with our token-heavy game plan. And at long last, reaching our lone remaining Planeswalker entry, we have the colorless Ugin the Ineffable, who comes into play with 4 loyalty. His passive reduces the cost of all our colorless spells by 2. His +1 exiles the top card of our deck face down and creates a 2/2 spirit token that, when it leaves the battlefield, puts the exiled card into our hand, and his -3 destroys target permanent that's 1 or more colors. His +1 being superb in this build as a way for us to get more spirits onto the battlefield for Quintorius to sack to his effect, netting us a card in the process, while his colorless cost reduction and repeatable permanent destruction on top of that make him even better by helping us pad our core stats. That covers all our Planeswalkers, so let's move on to our land base. Quickly running down our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower, Battlefield Forge, and Fury Calm Snarl as dual lands that typically come into play untapped to help improve consistency without sacrificing speed. The Scryland Temple of Triumph, which serves as another dual land that makes up for its low speed via its ETB Scry to help smooth out our draws, which is particularly valuable in the early game to ensure we make our land drops and hit our ramp sources. The slow fetches Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, which provide additional fixing while getting basics out of our deck to hopefully not hit as many in the late game, and Myriad Landscape, which provides us with one last bit of ramp from our land slot to speed up our mana base so we can more reliably hardcast our walkers instead of solely relying on Quint to cheat them into play for us. Then for utility lands, we'll be running Interplanar Beacon and a Karn's Bastion. Interplanar Beacon gains us 1 life whenever we cast a Planeswalker spell, taps for our colorless, and lets us pay 1 and tap it to generate 2 mana of different colors that we can only spend to cast Planeswalker spells. The passive life gain it provides us with as we cast and recast our walkers, helping us pad our life totals quite nicely, while the mana filtering provided for our primary playmakers ensures we'll usually not be hosed on a particular color to cast them. Karn's Bastion taps for a colorless and lets us pay 4 and tap it to proliferate, giving us 1 last way to multiply the loyalty counters on our walkers from the relative safety of our land slot. And finally, we'll be running 15 plains and 12 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 11 creatures including the commander, 3 instants, 7 sorceries, 6 enchantments, 14 artifacts, 24 planeswalkers including MDFCs, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 33 cards that either directly or indirectly care about planeswalkers, 10 cards that can increase our planeswalkers' loyalty, 6 cards that can tutor and or dig for planeswalkers to put directly into our hand or into play, 7 cards that either let us copy or get extra activations out of our planeswalkers' loyalty abilities, 15 sources of creature tokens, and 6 sources of graveyard setup, giving us quite a robust amount of support to enable our Super Friends game plan, ranging from ways to uptick our walkers faster, getting them into our hand or into play more reliably, and even getting us extra uses out of their abilities, alongside a sizable creature token sub-theme to help make up for the core build's lack of creatures in the 99, and a handful of ways to get our walkers directly into our bin to enable Quint instead of relying on them just running out of loyalty. Then for general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 11 card draw sources, 12 targeted removal sources, and 6 board wipes, with our ramp being slightly higher than normal to ensure we can hardcast our planeswalkers and or be able to activate our commander's ability every turn while still having mana left over to cast other spells, and our wipes being off the charts since a lot of them are built into our walkers kits, which helps us keep our opponent's creature counts low so that our walkers can safely increase their loyalty. Then looking at our mana curve, we have 3 1-drops, 12 2-drops, 15 3-drops, 13 4-drops, 11 5-drops, 8 6-drops, 1 7-drop, and 1 9-drop, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that can be faster than it initially appears since our commander can get the majority of our higher CMC spells into play for us at a discount, in which we'll be ramping hard in the early game, ideally while sending targets for Quint to reanimate to our bin via our loot effects and while casting planeswalker support pieces, and then we can just sit back and cast walker after walker that will drown our opponents in seas of token bodies and repeatable value that our commander can bring right back into play once they've been used up or destroyed, inevitably crushing our opponents with our walkers' back-breaking ultimates and the gigantic board states they're able to create for us. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.15, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, the Wanderer can be traded for Semester's End to provide the build with a means to both protect our walkers and reset their loyalty counters that our commander can then reuse, though we will be making our pool of walkers smaller and lose out on some removal. And Onaki Oathkeeper can be swapped for Deification as a different source of protection for the various Elspeths and Chandras we'll be running, but at the cost of making our other planeswalkers more vulnerable and losing out on some reanimation. Then for upgrades, we can cut the Wanderer for Comet Stellar Pup, who may have random effects, but 3 out of 4 of them are great for us to get extra tokens into play, deal damage to creatures or face, and sometimes even both. Contagion Clasp can be shelved for Luxor Gadia's Gift, which provides the equipped walker with protection against being attacked directly and losing loyalty counters due to damage so they can stick around for longer, as well as getting us a decent sized body that we can use to swing in with or protect our other walkers with. And Gideon Jura can be put back to rest for All Will Be One, which tacks on a decent amount of removal and or burn whenever we uptick our planeswalkers through their own loyalty abilities or through other means, helping us keep the board clear of threats or to push for lethal. And lastly, Chandra Flamecaller can be replaced with Ugin the Spirit Dragon, who provides the build with repeatable targeted removal to deal with up to mid-sized creatures, a scalable board wipe to help keep the board clear of permanent threats while minimizing the losses we take to our walkers, and a back-breaking ultimate that not only reloads our hand, but also lets us dump a huge amount of permanent spells into play for free as well to completely take over the game with. Though coming in at just over a third of this deck's entire budget means we'll need to dish out some additional green if we want to run him despite being a colorless walker. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. First off, I would like to thank all the channel subscribers for helping the channel climb all the way up to the 14K subscriber milestone. It's thanks to all of your support that this channel keeps growing, so thank you all so much for the support you've given us up to this point, as we quite literally could not have done it without you. Now, moving on to next week's build, since it looks like the Wilds of Eldraine Commander decks have managed to sneak up on us right after the Commander Masters builds, we'll again have to put the builds for Saruman the White Hand and Tom Bombadil on hold while we cover the precon upgrades for the new decks, which will start next week with the precon upgrade for Fey Dominion. But rest assured, we'll be going right back to them once the precons are covered before switching to Wilds of Eldraine builds, so stay tuned. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck text floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.